Dentinisti referred to the policies as apartheid-like. Israel's former education minister, Shulamit Aloni, referred to the policies as apartheid-like. Israel's main newspaper, Haaretz, has repeatedly in its editorials referred to Israeli policies in the occupied territories as apartheid-like. In the real world, it's not controversial at all. What happened to President Carter? It was very interesting to watch. When his book came out, he was first accused of being a plagiarist. He was then accused of being in the pay of Arab sheikhs. He was then accused of being an anti-Semite. He was then accused, and these are literal, they're not my poetic embellishments. He was then accused of being a borderline Holocaust denier. He was then accused of being a Nazi sympathizer. He was then accused of being a supporter of Arab terrorism. What was very striking when you read the reviews, is nobody talked about the content of his book. And that was the whole point. His book is not a brilliant piece of scholarship, but it gets the basic facts right, and sometimes with quite vivid language. Chapter 16 is entitled "The Wall as a Prison," and he goes through what Israel is doing, its depredations in Bethlehem and around Jerusalem. And he then concludes, as I said to you earlier, that peace will come to Palestine and the Middle East when Israel withdraws to its legal borders and respects international law. Well, they don't want to discuss that. That's that documentary record, that uncontroversial documentary record. But something different happened with Mr. Carter, which is an indication of serious changes that are occurring in North American society. That is, despite being called a plagiarist, borderline Holocaust denier, anti-Semite, apologist for Arab terrorism, and so forth, his book reached #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, stood there for several months, sold in hardcover 300,000 copies, which is a very impressive number. And then Carter, he feels perfectly confident of his views, and I think he knows which way the wind is blowing, a topic to which I'll get to the last remarks in a moment. Carter says, okay, I'll go to Brandeis University. Brandeis is the oldest secular Jewish university in the United States, overwhelmingly Jewish student body. He goes to Brandeis, and 2,000 people show up, students, because they didn't allow people from the community to come. 2,000 students come, overwhelmingly Jewish. Carter, he gets 4 standing ovations from that overwhelmingly Jewish student body. And when he was finished, Professor Dershowitz of Harvard was asked to deliver the reply. And when Professor Dershowitz went up to deliver the reply, before he could utter a word, it is reported that about 2/3 of the audience walked out. And that gives you a sense, one indication of a major change which I think is occurring in North America. Namely, Israel's real record is now much better known than ever before. And that record cannot be reconciled with those bedrock liberal values, of which the rule of law is one, to which most North American Jewry, who are liberal in their political persuasions and social values, it cannot be reconciled with those values any longer. And in fact, Israel is becoming an embarrassment. And for that reason, you see trends which I'll go through quickly now, and then end my remarks there, which indicate that American Jewry, and presumably it applies as well to Canadian Jewry, I haven't looked at the polls for Canada, applied. 2003, a poll of the European Union named Israel the biggest threat to world peace. 2007, the BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation, did a survey of 12 major nations. It found that Israel had the most negative image, more negative than Iran. Throughout Europe and in places like Australia, alternative groups have formed to the mainstream Jewish organizations. If you look at the picture in the United States, it's accurate to say that Israel has still a favorable opinion among Americans in general. That's for sure. There are some qualifications to that. Just to give you the latest picture, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, its 2007 poll found that Israel is much less admired than places like the UK and Japan, and its favorable rating is somewhere in the area of India and Mexico, which is not exactly a resounding approval. The more interesting results for our purposes is the question of the case of American Jews. 2005 survey found, quote, the attachment of American Jews to Israel has weakened measurably in the last 2 years, continuing a long-term trend. Jews care less, talk less, and act pro-Israeli less than ever before. The main American Jewish pollster, Stephen Cohn, predicted, quote, a polarization of American Jewry in the long run, a small group of pious Jews growing more pious and attached to Israel, while a larger group drifts away. These tendencies are most striking among younger Jews. So, for example, a 2006 poll was asked, how close do you feel to Israel? Among Jews under 40, 1/3 answered distant. The most striking result of these polls was the one this past year. Among Jews under 35, less than half said, quote, Israel's destruction would be a personal tragedy. That is, more than 50% said if Israel were destroyed, it would not affect them personally. I found that pretty striking because, to speak in all candor, if Israel were destroyed, I would take it as a personal tragedy. I think the destruction of any state is a horror and ought to be a source of revulsion. But of Jews under 35, less than half said Israel's destruction would be a personal tragedy. And probably the most, to my thinking, the most indicative poll, or poll finding, which nobody has called much attention to, was in the last survey done by the American Jewish Committee. It asked the following question. It said to American Jews, if Iran has nuclear weapons, do you think the U.S. should attack? Now, bear in mind that Israel, as I mentioned earlier, has been saying Iran is not just Hitler, but Benjamin Netanyahu has been saying that Iran is worse than Hitler. He wants to annihilate, says Mr. Netanyahu. He wants to annihilate not only all the Israeli Jews, he wants to annihilate all the American people as well. So we're being told by we're being told by Netanyahu. That was a funny talk. We're told by Mr. Netanyahu that Iran is worse than Hitler and threatening a Holocaust worse than Hitler's. But when American Jews were put to question, should you attack Iran if it has nuclear weapons, 60% said no. They don't care. That's a very striking finding. And I think it's basically for two reasons. One, people want peace in this world, especially if you're a person of liberal values. Your liberal values, you presumably came of age in the 1960s when the common chant was, give peace a chance. And you have some residue, even if you've gotten a little conservative, you have some residue of that memory. But then you have the case of Israel. 2002, in the lead up to the war in Iraq, there are only two countries in the world where the population overwhelmingly supports a war against Iraq. Only two. The United States, the US was not overwhelming. Two countries in the world, Israel and Kuwait. Those are the only two countries. Then the build-up to the intended war in Iran, there's only one country in the world where the population overwhelmingly supports a war. It's Israel, about 78%. When the NIE, the National Intelligence Estimate, comes out, it shows that apparently Iran is not currently involved in the program to produce nuclear weapons. The whole world breathes a sigh of relief. There's not going to be a war with Iran. The whole world except Israel. If you recall, immediately as the NIE report came out, there were huge denunciations issued by one state in the world, Israel, claiming the NIE report was false. And for American Jewry, this poses a problem. You're liberal. Give peace a chance. And then you have a state which claims to speak in your name, and it's saying, give war a chance, and more war, and more war. And it's progressively turning not only into an embarrassment, it's turning into a problem, which is different. Because, as most of you in this room know, there was a claim, which got considerable play in the media, that Israel or Israel supporters were responsible for that first disaster in Iraq. And now it was beginning to look like Israel was going to be responsible for that second disaster, impending disaster in Iran. And for both of those reasons, American Jewry rationally began to worry that there might be, due to Israel's belligerence, there might be, and it was a real problem, an anti-Semitic backlash in the United States. If Iran turns into a second debacle like Iraq, Jews may be blamed for it. And so for both of those reasons, one, it's just antithetical to the liberal values that most Jews espouse, and two, for reasons of self-interest, American Jews were beginning again to distance themselves from what has become, if we can use the Yiddish term, has become a meshuggah state, a crazy state, at least by the standards of current world opinion. And I think it should be giving us some reason for hope. And the hope is this, that the more the record becomes clarified, the more we adhere strictly to principles, basic principles of truth, what the record shows, and justice, what human rights organizations, what judicial bodies have decided. If we adhere to the principles, the basic principles of truth and justice, and the truth comes out, people apply basic principles of right and wrong based on that truth, I think we can